Hi, this is Dale Anderson. I'm going to be doing a whole series of videos for police primarily, and I'm going to be talking about the Constitution. Everybody loves the Constitution, but nobody seems to really understand it. And what we're going to try to do, at least to the best of my ability, is to explain at first the Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment has 54 words, and you could probably fill the room you're in with all the cases that explain the Fourth Amendment. So what I'm going to try to do is to explain how the Fourth Amendment works for for officers. And in order to do this, I'm going to split searches and seizures. The Fourth Amendment discusses searches and seizures. And we're going to start first with seizures. I get asked once in a while to consult for law enforcement, sometimes for prosecutors. And relatively recently, I was asked to consult on a particular case. And let me just give you a little background here. What happened was that officers get called out on a 911 domestic with shots fired. The officers go to the house where this occurred, and they get the man and the woman outside. They handcuff them and put them in the back seat of the patrol car. And it so happens, as they go through the house, they realize that they've been fooled. That somehow somebody decided to choose this particular house, and that there was no shooting, there was no domestic there at all. And what happened was that they decided to unhandcuff the two people, and the two people get an attorney, the man and the woman. They sue and get from a jury over $1 million. Now, the same attorney has been retained in a separate suit that I was asked to consult on. So let me talk just briefly about how I look at the various issues involved in seizures first, and then I'm going to tell you how this attorney, or what this attorney is suing for. First, let me say that basically every time an officer deals with a person, they're dealing with what we call a seizure question or a seizure issue. Now, the way we look at these seizure questions, or the way the courts do, is to divide them into 3 tiers. I'm going to show now what the tiers are. The first tier is what we call no seizure at all. The second tier is a seizure. You can see the gray area here. It's what we call a Terry stop. Relatively recently, in the last 20 years, this is also called a traffic stop. And we have a tier 3, which is called a significant restraint, custody, or sometimes tantamount to arrest. Now, in order to be in these different tiers, there's different levels of suspicion required. For example, in tier 1, no suspicion is required, and it's called a contact or a consensual encounter. In tier 2, an officer has to have reasonable suspicion to stop somebody on the street or in their car. And this is called a detention or a stop. Tier 3 is what we call custody, arrest, significant restraint, and to be in tier 3, there must be probable cause. Now, what happened recently, do you remember when I started my presentation, I told you that there was an attorney who sued officers, and let me tell you what the suit was about. It was about an officer who, at least one officer, who went out to stand by while a woman retrieved her clothes. Now, this happens in every city just about in the country every day. What happened in this particular case was the officer told the male, the gentleman there, to stand in a certain place while the woman got her clothes. That's what the officer got sued for. So let's talk about this for a moment. If we were to talk about all of the different cases that are generated in this model, we would have literally thousands, maybe tens of thousands of cases. And we would literally have an infinite number of what ifs. Let me tell you where the questions start and the issues begin. What we call the threshold issue begins here at this line. Is the officer in Tier 1 a consensual encounter, or has the officer passed over into Tier 2? The United States Supreme Court, in a case called Mendenhall, created a list or a list of things or criteria to help officers to understand, excuse me, which tier they're in, and also to allow attorneys and courts to understand what the rules are. So basically, what the 4 criteria are here is first, number 1, how many officers are present? If there's only 2 officers present, it tends to be a consensual encounter or a Tier 1. If there's more than 2 officers, it tends to be a Tier 2. A second criterion is, did the officer pull out his weapon? So if he didn't pull out his weapon, he has it holstered, it tends to be a Tier 1. If he pulls out his weapon, it tends to be Tier 2. The third criterion is, did the officer touch the suspect or touch the citizen? Now, by touching, it means grabbing him, basically. What created Tier 2 here was Terry v. Ohio. And everyone watching this knows that in Terry versus Ohio, the officer actually grabbed Terry. That was Officer McFadden in Cleveland, Ohio, grabbed Terry and turned him around. That is a Tier 2. Now, incidentally touching someone, like you touch their arm or whatever, is generally a Tier 1. The final criterion is a little bit, or factor is a little bit more subjective. What it involves is, does the officer create, by virtue of his demeanor, a situation where the person doesn't feel free to leave or to ignore the officer? If the person feels free to leave or ignore the officer, then the person is in Tier 1. If the person doesn't feel free to leave or ignore the officer, the person is in Tier 2. Well, what happened in this particular case that you just heard was that all the officers did was to say to the person whom he didn't have reasonable suspicion to detain, you need to stand right here while the female gets her clothes. Now, how many of you would think that that is a situation that you can be sued for? So what we're going to do during the course of discussing these different cases, and as I said, there's an infinite number of what ifs here. And I'm going to be discussing the big cases generally, the United States Supreme Court cases. But what I want you to do is to think, where am I in this model? Because there are a zillion what ifs in Tier 1. There's a zillion situations where you're on the border here. And there are a number of situations where officers go into Tier 2 without knowing it because they don't understand the Mendenhall factors that every officer has to understand in order to know which tier, whether he's in Tier 1 or Tier 2. We're going to talk a lot as we go about Tier 2, what it means, and why it's so important. And we're going to also discuss what happens when the officer goes into Tier 3, that is, must have probable cause. So we'll be discussing that in the videos to come.